All right. So, everyone, welcome to the latest Trees Around the Globe Student Research Campaign webinar. This is the State of Trees, June 2023. Time Traveling with Trees, the NASA Moon Trees program with Apollo 14 and Artemis, and a timeline of NASA Earth observations from space. So, just something to think about. We were talking about this. This kind of came up when we were having our planning meeting. It's just something we just thought up. You know, I'm not sure if it's a combination of our team thinking, but and this will make sense soon, especially when our own Peter Nelson will be talking about some of the things with Landsat 1 all the way through Landsat Next later in the webinar. So it's not safe to feel comfortable assuming that what we see now as far as land cover and trees is what we will see in 5+ years. So just think of that kind of in the back of your head, you know, as we're doing the webinar today. So our agenda, as you can see, it's pretty jam-packed. I'm going to go over some metrics, and then I'm going to pass it over to Peter Nelson. I have a slide that Peter can talk to, or if he wants to share, that's fine. Just a brief recap of Where is the Water, a Globe Observer Data Challenge, because Peter was the lead for that challenge. And then I will introduce the NASA Moon Trees Quest 2023. And we have some folks on here that are a big part of that and the planning related to it. And then we will have the featured presentation about the NASA Moon Trees program with Apollo 14, Artemis, and Globe Observer, where we will have John D. Davis Jr., Education Specialist 2, the NASA Next Gen STEM at Johnson Space Center, and then me, and then Peter Nelson. And then we will go through reviewing a timeline of NASA Earth observations from space. And then there's a couple questions I want you to think about towards the end. There'll be another couple questions where I'm going to pop in the chat for you to answer. And Peter Nelson is going to lead that part. You know, I'll discuss some of the timelines that we have at NASA Earth Science right now, and what some of these satellites are measuring and why they're important. But then also we will then go through, you know, we've talked about Landsat in the past with looking at land cover observations, and it's kind of a history of what we're seeing over time. You know, Landsat's been around for over 50 years. Okay, from Landsat 1 all the way through today, Landsat 9, and then the next Landsat Next, you know, after that. So we will talk a lot about, you know, this in the near future, coming up in a webinar and future webinars as well. So here are some metrics that I always like to show. Okay, at the bottom, we're in year 5 right now, and these are the numbers coming in since October 1st of 2022. And we're over 18,000 tree height measurements, 4,500 plus land cover measurements, and 7,500 plus green up, green down measurements. And here's a map of where they're all coming from. All right. We also, I want to showcase this big number at the bottom. So as you know, we always try to focus on when we talk about the students and how they're doing their student research, whether it be for a local research, you know, for their schools or for their community, or the Globe International Virtual Science Symposia, the virtual science fair every year, is that we're looking at this change over time. And we're going to talk more about that today. We're looking at change over time with all the Landsat missions as well. But with that said, you know, you can see here the total since we started the campaign on 15th of September 2018. Okay, we have had 155,428 observations from 52,182 global sites. All right, and this is just in tree height, land cover, and greenings, which is green up, green down. Okay, green up in the spring, green down in the fall. All right, so we have lots of cool stuff happening all the time with the campaign. All right, but there's some really cool things that are coming up in the future, trees related, land cover related, etc. So I'm going to pass it over briefly to Peter Nelson to give a little recap on Where is the Water, a Globe Observer Data Challenge, which ran through the month of May. And this is what you can find on the website, this metric that's on the website. So Peter, want to say a couple things about this?
Gladly, Brian. I really appreciate that. And so here, I wanted to highlight, just the way that I, as a scientist, am actually looking at some of this data and some of this information when we, kind of focus on a particular challenge or a particular time of year. I think, this is a really important thing to think about is how we can summarize across not only around the globe, but also, depending on different time slices. And so here, I want to highlight that we focused on about 30 days. And so, right now we've got a lot of data that has recently come in that hasn't really been analyzed. So, I think that's a wonderful opportunity as we think about students, student projects, what's going on, because this challenge of where is the water, not only did we record the water, where water is located, but also this what's surrounding that water. And in May, I know one of the things that we saw in a lot of the photos that were coming in, especially in the northern hemisphere, is some of the trees that were flooded out, or their, as we said in the last webinar, their feet were wet. And so I think one of the things that's going to be interesting is, and also a challenge, is to see if we can do any repeat photos and see how those trees change over the summer. Did having a lot of water actually impact their growth? Do they? What's sort of happening with them? And one of the things that I've been tracking and seeing is that we're having a climatic shift right now with El Nino and La Nina, kind of related to the temperature of the ocean. And so that changes the whole dynamic of where water's located. And I know here in the Pacific Northwest in the United States, where I'm located, you could actually see an example of the science that and maps that are coming out that we want to combine together with our ground photos. Just a simple, is that water? Is that not water? Is that first question that we have when we're looking at Earth from space. It's one of the easiest. But we have that opportunity right now to actually explore this data set that came in with these satellite images that were coincident. I just kind of want to highlight this really interesting trend that we had inside of here. Importantly, kind of highlight the amount of data that we have that nobody's looked at before, and nobody's really combined it together with the satellite data like this. So I think one thing that we wanted to really mention is we've highlighted some new satellite missions, like the Surface Water Ocean Topography mission. That would be a perfect new set of data that is supposed to help us understand that volume or the height of the water. So that's brand new science that we've been able to bring to you in this particular campaign. And that if you're interested in providing something very brand new for your students, let Brian or I know about that, or Peter Falcon know, and we will try to help connect you to that data that is currently under review and will be released in October. And so, so that to me is a really interesting opportunity that we've been able to plan for through this event, because that satellite was taking those measurements at that time. And so along those lines, Brian, if you go to the next slide, I want to highlight a great way for all of you teachers and Globe partners who are on this call. As you are thinking about what we do here in Globe, I want to share with you a brand new podcast that was just released today, actually, on June 20th. And this is put together by the U.S. Geological Survey and the Eros Data Center. And this is the group that actually archives the land processing data that you will probably want to use when you are looking at what's happening on Earth. They're the ones that archive the Landsat data, as well as a lot of other things related to our Trees Around the Globe student research campaign. And so this is a short, I'll say short because you can already tell how long I can talk. This is a short, pithy 20 minutes that talks about this idea of generational science. And I want to sort of end here, because for me, this is why I'm with the Globe program and why we're doing this Trees Around the Globe student research campaign, is because trees are a long-lived species that actually ties together between generations and throughout time in literally the same place. We rarely have an old tree that has gotten up and moved from its location, right? So we have these fixed locations that if that tree is still standing and photosynthesizing, it hasn't really moved from its original seedling location. And to me, this is just a really interesting thing to think about what those trees have experienced in their own life. We've all kind of gone through this pandemic and gone through a particular disease outbreak and that kind of thing. The same things happen to our forests out there. And it might be that they experience a beetle outbreak, over time. And you can see that in how tall those trees are, who's living there, i.e. the species or the leaf type that's there. And so, I feel like our responsibility right now and what we've been trying to do with this research campaign is help us to archive where the trees are located today and what they look like. So I encourage you to take a listen to me continue jabbering on about this wonderful thing of generational science, but to think about what we're going to be talking about today, and recognize that trees, just like humans, don't last forever. And how do we use science? How do we use something like the GLOBE program and the database and those structures, as well as the satellite measurements, to tell our stories of what we are seeing and even why we see the things that we are? And some of you have highlighted you're planting trees. Great, let's record that, right? And all of those things that are happening around us, we have the tools to help not only our own science, but also other people who are responsible for this mapping, measuring, monitoring, and stewardship of this incredible resource, which are trees around the globe. So Brian, back to you.
All right, thank you, Peter. And go ahead, if you haven't already, can you pop those links in the chat, please?
I will do that while you guys are all talking.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you so much, Peter. All right, so with that said, and this leads us into our featured presentation in a few minutes, is that starting tomorrow, we have the NASA Moon Trees Quest. It's a 3-month quest, okay? And it's a collaboration between the GLOBE program's Globe Observer, the Artemis mission, the USDA Forest Service, NASA Office of STEM Engagement, and Next Gen STEM program. So we have an amazing, amazing quest on the way. Now, I will mention that this is a quest, it's a regional quest in the United States, because this is focusing on the moon trees, the Apollo 14 moon trees, which the majority of those were planted in the United States. And there are a couple in South America, but the majority of those in the United States. So we're going to be asking people to go check them out. So here's what's going to happen, okay? And if you happen to be in another country and you're visiting the United States, like several of you are most likely coming to Denver, Colorado, and you're going to be, around the, Globe annual meeting next month, and there are some trees, Apollo 14 trees, and also these tree species that are flown Apollo 14 around the area where we're going to be in Denver, okay? So the first goal of this challenge, okay, this quest is, the challenge here is to, one, take Globe Observer app tree height observations of the same types of tree species that were on board Apollo 14 and that were brought back, germinated, and planted around the United States. Okay, and these are Douglas fir, loblolly pine, sweet gum, and sycamore. Now, I know it says giant sequoia, okay? On Apollo 14, there were coast redwood seeds flown and then brought back, germinated, and planted, okay? But because coast redwood has such a limited distribution in the United States, Artemis took tree seeds to the moon, okay? Artemis 1 took it to the trip to the moon, but then they replaced the coast redwood with giant sequoia because it has a larger geographic distribution in the US. But what we're looking for are Douglas fir, loblolly pine, sweet gum, sycamore, and coast redwood for this goal number 1. Now, goal number 2, when you're using the app to measure tree height and your app's open and you happen to be within 25 miles of an actual accessible on public property Apollo 14 moon tree, the app will alert you to this by giving you a latitude and longitude and a physical address to where it's located or nearby where it's located. Okay, it might be the address of a building that the tree is growing next to. With that said, okay, the app has to be open in order for this. You're not going to get alerts popping up to your phone when your app's not open. Okay, it's only when your app's open. You know, you'll frequently get, you know, the one that says, hey, you know, this is the moon trees quest. You know, you're in an area in the United States where you can observe these trees, but if you're within 25 miles of one of these trees, it will pop up saying, hey, you're near an Apollo 14 moon tree. Here's a latitude, longitude. Here's a little information about the location where it is, and here is an address. So if you can safely go there and if it's, you know, fits within your time schedule and budget, feel free to go and take that tree height observation. And then we also have it set up, you know, and you'll see in the app that we'd like you to, in the comment section, as you know, before you submit it, just put in a hashtag like hashtag moon trees or hashtag moon tree. And we will then know that that observation that comes into the Globe database is associated with this NASA moon trees quest, okay? So this is, once again, starting tomorrow, Wednesday, 21st of June, and it's running for 3 months. So please also stay tuned to social media, Globe social media, NASA social media, as well as others, okay, even Artemis as well, because you will see either, you know, these groups will share about the quest, but then also they will amplify, meaning that you will see on Twitter, you'll see retweets from other groups who are sharing it. You may see Facebook posts and Facebook shares from these different groups about this quest. And we have a whole website here, and if somebody wants to pop that into the chat, feel free, or I can do that after the presentation. But or you can just Google. Yeah, I don't know if Google. I'm not thinking what the meta tags are right now, but you know, if you go to the Globe Observer page, you know, there's a scrolling banner on the top. And one of them will be the Moon Trees Quest, so that's there, and you can go and check it out. All right, so you know, stay tuned for more information about this. I will give an update on the July webinar as well, and then the August webinar and September as well, and then probably November. You know, the final you know, metrics for the quest. So you know, feel free to do this if you're in the United States or just visiting the United States. Feel free to do this, and I will mention on the website for each one of these tree species that are there. Okay, we do have imagery to show you what a Douglas fir tree looks like, what a loblolly pine, and so on, what they look like, what the trees look like, what the bark looks like, what the pine cones or buds look like, okay? So you know what you're looking for. And I just recently found out that about 5 miles from where I live, there's a street called Loblolly Avenue, and I've looked, and there's tons of loblolly pine trees there. So some of them I can access, some of them are on private property. So I'm going to try to get the ones that I can access from the road that you can basically walk to on the sidewalk. So, you know, I wanted to give you an introduction to this because it's happening tomorrow. All right. With that said, we are going to jump into today's featured presentation. And today, 3 of us will be presenting. And after this slide, I'm going to unshare, then I just share a separate presentation where we have some slides. But the first speaker is going to be John D. Davis Jr., Education Specialist 2 from NASA Next Gen STEM program, Johnson Space Center. And then I will come in and talk a little bit more about trees and why they're important, why tree heights are important, things like that. And then Peter Nelson will tie it all together at the end about what we're doing and why this matters, looking at the ground-based things versus the space-based observations and how it all ties together. Okay, then we will then go after the feature presentation into looking at some timelines of Earth observations from space and how we've seen things change, basically, in the last 50 years or so with the Landsat program. And then we will tease you with a little bit of a slide with what we're going to be showcasing at the July webinar, which ties into exactly what we're doing here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing and then reshare the other PowerPoint presentation, and then I will pass it over to John. So let me do this real fast here so I can come back to this. Here we go. And let's see, John's ready to go. So let me share this again. All right, here we have show and all right, that look good on your end, John? Can you see that?
Looks good.
All right, so let me pass it over to you, John, and I will, there we go again with the presenters again, and I will, let me just
there we go
up here like that, and take it away, John.
All right, first off, let me just say thank you, Brian, and to the rest of the Globe team for having me. Definitely happy to be here. All right, so let's get started. So the first thing is let's just talk a little bit about Next Gen STEM. So Next Gen STEM is a project under NASA's Office of STEM Engagement. Our mission is to spark and sustain K through 12 student interest in science, technology, engineering, and math, otherwise known as STEM, by connecting students to NASA's endeavors in exploration and discovery. So to do this, Next Gen STEM creates and delivers STEM products and experiences that make these connections to NASA and fuel their STEM learning and identity. So Next Gen STEM is an integration hub and entry point for K through 12 educators to both formal and informal to the world of NASA K through 12 resources. Basically, we help curate, help navigate, and support teachers using NASA's universe of resources, and we are committed to diversity and inclusion. When we reduce the barriers to participation, we believe that we can broaden student participation in STEM. All right, next slide. All right, so let's go into a little bit of history about the moon trees, or the Apollo moon trees, I should say. Brian kind of alluded to some of that with the whole quest that's going to be kicking off tomorrow, which is really cool. So let's talk about astronaut Stuart Roosa, which you see here on your screen. So more than half a century ago, NASA astronaut Stuart Roosa, the command module pilot for the Apollo 14 mission and former USDA Forest Service smoke jumper, that's cool, carried tree seeds from loblolly pine, American sycamore, sweet gum, coast redwood, and Douglas fir trees into lunar orbit. While crewmates Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell were spending those 2 days exploring the lunar surface, Roosa conducted experiments aboard the Kitty Hawk command capsule with the first generation of moon trees in tow. So making 34 complete lunar orbits before returning to the Earth. The Apollo 14 moon trees were grown into seedlings by the Forest Service and eventually disseminated to dignitaries around the world, with a large number of them as part of the nation's bicentennial event. For a period, the final location of many of the moon trees remained a mystery. Like, we could not find them. Some of them unfortunately had died off. But thanks to a third grade teacher in 1996, NASA planetary scientist and lunar historian Dr. David Williams, I should say, launched a program to locate those Apollo moon trees that were still living, and leading to the most current moon tree database, which you can actually Google and see their locations. Or you can do that Quest app and try to locate some as well. All right, let's move to the next slide. All right, so here you're just looking at a picture of an actual moon tree. This is at Kennedy Space Center. So pretty cool. So if you're down at Kennedy Space Center, you can go check out an actual Apollo moon tree and actually use the Quest to engage. All right, next slide. All right, so as you can see here on this screen, as we move into what we like to call the Artemis generation, we took it to the next step and wanted to fly those tree seeds on the Artemis 1 mission. So 4 of the 5 species flown on the original Moon Trees mission are on board, again, because they are common species and together represent a broad geographic area of the lower 48 states. And Dr. Katzen Demrosi, senior scientist with the USDA Forest Service, he said Coast Redwood, and I believe, Brian, you talked a little bit about this, the Coast Redwood with a somewhat limited natural range was replaced with its cousin, the giant sequoia, which has more of a widespread use in parks and arboreta. For this mission, scientists included additional seed sources for 2 species having large natural ranges, American sycamore and Douglas fir. These additional seed sources will help the Moon Trees team match the species with outplanting sites to ensure long-term genetic adaptability. These are some really cool species of trees. One cool fact that I didn't know is that the giant sequoia can have age ranges up to over 3,000 years old, which is pretty fascinating. All right, next slide. So one of the main objectives here, which is why we're all here today, is to engage you all in citizen science, data, literacy, and conservation education. So with this generation of Artemis moon trees, we wanted to make those connections to STEM and to educations, to get people involved, to get people like you, students, teachers, everybody that loves this place that we call Earth, to get them involved with different things that relate to the trees and really cool moon trees. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And here are just some really cool pictures that we like to share. This is the splashdown that happened actually back in December of 22. This is the Orion space capsule, which the seeds traveled aboard. And you see those splashdown pictures there. After they were recovered, they're at KSC. They're doing all those experiments on them, and actually now they're being grown into seedlings. So we can't wait to get those into the ground. Next slide. And with that being said, you have an opportunity to really, really connect with moon trees, not with just the quest that's going to be kicking off tomorrow, but also with some of the other STEM resources, moon tree resources that we have available, such as our toolkit. So if you scan that QR code on your screen, you can be connected to the STEM toolkit, as well as some other cool things. But I haven't even revealed the coolest thing that you might get the opportunity to do. And that is you could very well host your own moon tree seedling. So we'll have information coming out about how you can obtain that through NASA's artifact module. So be on the lookout. You could possibly host a moon tree, grow a moon tree at your school, museum, or some other institution. So pretty cool stuff coming out about the Artemis moon trees. Thank you so much, Brian.
All right, thank you, John. Yeah, that's so exciting. I can't wait for that information to come out. I know a lot of other people are really waiting for that. And I should also mention that Moon Tree STEM toolkit that you see here. If you Google that, I mean, it is a really, really cool site. There's lots of really cool things on that. Not just because I see the back of my head in one of those pictures there, but showing how to take a tree height observation. But There are really, really cool amount of resources there. And John, if you could pop that in the chat, if you haven't already,
I sure can.
that toolkit, that would be great, because I know
Will do.
all the people in the webinars always like to have these links, because they are dedicated educators and students, and SMEs who are part of the webinars all the time from around the world. So I know they'd be highly interested in that. Like I said, it's a great opportunity to take a look at. So, all right.
Definitely.
So thank you so much. So
thank you.
Yep. So I'm going to just briefly go through this, and some of you have seen some of these slides before, but I like to showcase, since we're talking about the Apollo 14 moon trees, the Artemis 1 moon trees, and all that, we really want to focus on why the heck is this so important? Why looking at trees and tree height? And I know lots of from all the webinars you've attended, that we really like to push on the importance of tree height and land cover. And NASA is able to create maps like this. What you're looking at, you can look here, you're looking at the greening or seasonality, the greenness of our planet. It's kind of a pulsation of seasons, and you can see how the trees and vegetation around the world are just growing, and then greening up, and then greening down, and back and forth again. So this is just a really, really cool graphic to showcase, and I'll pop the link in here a little later for where you can grab this. This was on the NASA Scientific Visualization Studio at the Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, that created this. So this is really cool, and it comes from the Terra satellite, the MODIS instrument on the Terra satellite. So this is just a really cool thing to focus on. So, and this one, probably every one of you on here has just about seen this one before, but so I won't go through everything specifically. But this is showcasing why tree height is so important, and why does NASA care, and why should you? Couple things here. Tree height is a most widely used indicator of an ecosystem's ability to grow trees. Tree height allows you to track the growth of trees over time. And at NASA, and I should say at NASA and beyond, and other science agencies and science research run universities, like where Peter Nelson is coming from, Oregon State University, and some other folks there who are at university as well, like Mike Jabot of New York. The tree height information that comes in is super vital to everyone, because there's many things that tree heights can tell us, just besides an ecosystem's ability to grow trees and tracking the growth of trees over time. But we can also look at the biomass of our planet. Trees can help us understand our carbon budget. They can help us understand how our planet's responding to a changing climate, because trees and tree height are basically indicators of climate change. Okay, because trees, as you know, pull in lots of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and through the process of photosynthesis converts that to oxygen. Okay, that's why we have these countries that are, a lot of countries that are mass producers, and unfortunately adding lots of pollutants into the atmosphere. A lot of them have these tree planting programs where they're planting 1 million trees, potentially 1 billion trees, to help offset that carbon that is being released into the atmosphere, and pulling that back down into these trees. And through photosynthesis. And the trees also, when they grow, they sequester or store this carbon as well. So there's lots of things you can tell by just the simple observation and measurement of tree height. And as you know, NASA has several missions that measure tree height from space, one being the Ice Cloud and Land Elevation Satellite 2, or ICESat-2 mission. There's also the JEDI instrument on the International Space Station, which isn't in operation right now. It's actually in storage on the International Space Station, because NASA needed to put another instrument where this one was located. So they disassembled JEDI, and they have it in storage. They have another instrument another instrument taking other observations. But in the fall of next year, JEDI will be put back into its location on the International Space Station, and it will continue to take the tree forest canopy observations in kind of those mid latitudes between 56 degrees north and 56 degrees south latitude. So we have a lot of trees on the planet. As you can see, we have 3 trillion trees and over 78,000 tree species. So there's lots of trees we've measured, and we've measured hundreds of billions of trees between ICESat-2 and JEDI, but that's not at the 3 trillion yet. That's also why we want these ground-based observations as well. So just lasers from space, this is how we measure it. Okay, when we measure tree height from space, we're firing laser pulses down, and we're calculating the time it takes for laser pulses to leave the instrument or the satellite bounce off the tree canopy, and then come back to the satellite. And over time, we can see changes in tree growth or trees coming down. We can see changes in tree height over time. All right. So this is JEDI, just showing you where it was located on the International Space Station. Okay, it was launched there and then attached to the space station, and then the lasers were turned on, and then the forest canopies were starting to be measured. So then we have ICET-2. ICET-2, even though its primary objective is looking at the ice, looking at the sea ice and ice sheets of in Antarctica, in Greenland, and in the Arctic. Okay, but because it's a laser altimeter in space, we're able to measure the height of trees as well, and other things like clouds. I should mention JEDI only looks at tree height, okay, forest canopy height. ICET-2, it's a near polar orbit, so it covers the entire planet. So it's looking at heights of bodies of water like the oceans and rivers and lakes and reservoirs. It's also looking at potentially the height of buildings, looking at the height of mountains, hills, landforms, volcanoes, anything that has elevation, even penguin colonies. We are able to actually measure the height of a few penguin colonies in Antarctica several years ago. So that's actually really cool. All right, so this is the app that you can do it with. You can join the quest and, looking at the tree heights this way. And then, historically, we have a handheld clinometer where you can build and use in classrooms. But then we also have the Globe Observer Trees tool for citizen science. A clinometer has the student do a little more of the math. In the app, we program the math into the app, so you don't have to spend a lot of time doing the math, but you can understand the procedure of how it's done. All right, so it's a pretty simple concept. This is my son taking this observation a couple years ago of a pine tree on his school grounds here in Salisbury, Maryland, in the United States. All right, so but I want to show you this video here at the top right. And you've seen this before, but this is kind of a replay of why we're doing this and how it's associated with the ICET-2 mission. All right, so here's where the tree heights are coming from. Okay, so that video tied in, why we're associating it with the comparing to the data, like Peter Nelson mentioned earlier, with the land cover data, how we compare these, the ground-based data, with the whereas a water challenge, how we can compare the data, the land cover data and mosquito data to NASA satellite data. Same thing can be done with the tree height data as well. We can compare it to the ICET-2 mission and JEDI and the JEDI instrument on the International Space Station. So here's where all these tree height observations have been coming from, since, basically the beginning of Globe with the handheld clinometer, but the pictures that you see came from the app and the trees tool on the Globe Observer. So this is just an example of how I did some comparisons with this, looking at the tree height and, looking at tree height and land cover in an area on my property. We have a wooded area on our property just outside our fence behind our house where a photon from ICET-2 hit, okay? And when this photon hit, it's a 13-meter diameter footprint. So all the trees that were in this 13-meter diameter footprint, the average of all those trees is what the height is that's returned of these trees to the satellite. So I went in and measured all the trees that I knew that the satellite could hit. I got an average of the 18.93 meters, and ICET-2 measured it at 19.66 meters, so super close, right? So We also have some really cool classroom activities that are part of this as well, that you can, you know, learn more about, you know, when you're taking observations of tree height, when you're looking for the Apollo 14 moon trees, and, you know, and looking for the tree species. But, you know, it's good to know why you're actually taking these measurements, right? So once again, there's another slide again with the Moon Trees Quest, because we like to focus that, because it's starting tomorrow, 21st of June, 2023. So then we have associated links, and you know, there's a lot of links here that were part of this. I will include all these links in the webinar, under the webinar recording, once I get the recording up, when Zoom gets it back to me, probably later today or probably first thing tomorrow, because it takes a little while for Zoom to process it and give me the email to let me know it's done. But if it happens to be today, I will get that out and send an email out to you guys. So right now I'm going to pass it over to Peter Nelson to kind of tie
Brian.
things together. Yes.
This is Peter. Before we do that, I was wondering, can we get John to address a couple of questions that are in the chat box?
Oh yeah, for sure.
And there's a couple of questions for you as well.
Very cool. So then Peter will then, after we address these questions, Peter, if you want to tie this together, then we'll go into the Earth timelines, if that's good for everyone.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah. If I could I'll just take a few minutes and ask. Let me turn my camera there. John, this is Peter Falcon. John, I have a couple questions. We have a couple questions for you.
Yes.
We can address them very quickly. Thank you for that. So one of our questions is, you mentioned the moon trees would be in the lower states in the US, right? So Joanna asked lower 48 states only, because she works in Alaska, and she's wondering if that would, if Alaska is counted as well.
Right. So I saw that question, and I was trying to ask some of my superiors who would know a little bit more. So we're trying to get the answer to that question. But I did see Puerto Rico. I do not think Puerto Rico, unfortunately, would be able to apply for a moon tree seedling. But I want to say Alaska may be safe, but I'm not 100% sure. And I have one of my colleagues looking that information up. So we just may need to confirm at a later time.
Thanks, John. And thank you for addressing Richard's question about Puerto Rico. We have another question from Mohammed. He asks, is there any difference observed between moon trees and regular Earth trees of the same species? And if you have an answer, great. If you don't, be happy to say pass.
Well, just from the little bit of knowledge that I know as far as some of the science that takes place that the USDA Forest Service is doing, of course, the exposure to radiation is a lot different from those trees that were flown on those missions, Apollo and Artemis 1. So looking at how that can affect tree species or the trees in general is something that I know is observed.
And for our folks who would be making those measurements, they would be safe from any radiation as well. Just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, sure they're perfectly fine. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, John. And thank you for putting in the chat box the Moon Trees Toolkit. We appreciate that. And if any more questions pop up for you, please address them in the chat box, or we'll just get back on the mic here and ask you. Thanks.
All right. All right. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. Brian, there are a couple questions for you as well.
Cool.
The first one is your video of ISAT2. People love it, so they're asking if they can get that. If you can provide a link for that as well, they can use that in their presentations.
I'll pop that in the chat.
Thank you. And Larissa asks, she's like, just double checking for my students, are they going to be measuring the moon tree heights for the moon trees activity? Is that correct? Just wants to verify what we're asking as far as this moon tree challenge.
Yes, for the Moon Trees Quest, there's kind of two steps. One is if you are in an area, we actually created these geographic areas where we have these borders we've created. You can see those on the map on the website for each one of the tree species. So if you're within an area that we've designated as a distribution area for, like, say, the loblolly pine, the app will ask you, hey, can you take, some observations of any loblolly pines you see? This is just general loblolly pine species, okay? Now, when you're in your app, if you happen to be within 25 miles of an official Apollo 14 moon tree, the app will tell you that you are, and it'll tell you a little bit about the location, the address, and the latitude and longitude will be provided. So if you're not near one of the Apollo 14 moon trees, then what you can do is you can just take the tree height observations with the NASA Globe Observer Trees tool of the tree species that you may encounter that are the same as Apollo 14 moon trees, but aren't actually the one of the 48 moon trees we're asking you to potentially find during the quest.
Thanks, Brian. There's actually quite a few questions that are popping up. Anna asks if there's any lunar trees in South America, and I think Elizabeth may have answered that. She actually, go ahead, Brian.
Yep, and I also put a link, Anna, to the NASA Moon Trees archive that John mentioned was started by Dr. David Williams at Goddard Space Flight Center. And you can see in his list that there are some in South America, and the locations of those are towards the bottom of that list that he has on that on the website that I just shared. You can see where they are. There's only a handful of them in South America right now. So but you can check that list out.
Thanks, Brian. And for any other questions regarding moon trees, Elizabeth has put the link there for STEM moontrees at mail.nasa.gov. So if you want to write that down or email them, feel free for any other questions about the moon trees. So once again, thanks, John. Thanks, Brian, for answering those questions. I will continue to look at the chat. So if there's any more, we can address them after Peter speaks.
Very cool. All right, Peter Nelson, you're on. As always, everybody, Peter does an amazing job with his presentations, and, take it away, Peter.
Thanks, Brian. I really appreciate that. And I think, one of the things that I just wanted to point out is that Globe and NASA are not the only ones who are making these maps of where things are located. And I think that's one of those wonderful things about thinking about this moon tree aspect, is that they were planted back, this mission and this experiment started in the 1970s. And so all of us, every single one of us has this question of, well, what has happened to these trees over time? And this kind of gets back into one of those challenges that Brian keeps putting in front of us, is like, well, what are those things that would affect the tree height, right? And so it goes beyond just actually, the first thing is making that measurement of tree height. Well, how tall is that tree today, right? And then once we get some characteristics about the tree itself, only then can we answer the question about, is that different than everybody else who has never left Earth, right? Like all those other Douglas fir trees that never actually went up into space and were not exposed to that space radiation. Remember, this is that wonderful thing that we have, this atmosphere that actually protects us from a lot of those things. And so, in essence, part of the reason why trees are green, or why you have the leaves that are green, is because of that sunlight that is able to get through the atmosphere to the surface of the earth and is used for photosynthesis. If your seedlings or the genetics are above that that protective layer, what happens? Okay, so I'm just going to preface this. I wasn't around when any of these moon trees were planted, or if I was not paying attention. I have no idea when some of these things were actually planted. So one of the things about this is a demonstration of data archaeology. Okay, so one of the things that we've highlighted, especially around trees, is rarely does anybody record where they've been planting trees or when those trees went in the ground, unless you are a land management agency or something like that, right? Like the Forest Service. So they actually do have these maps of species distribution that they've created that tries to tell us where things are living, who's living where on Earth. And so in the chat, I included that. Thing to remember is that is at that moment in time. Doesn't tell us anything about how those species might have changed over time, like since the Douglas fir seedlings were collected back in the 1970s. And I'm really excited about this quest because I, as a Globe partner in Oregon, am very connected to this moon tree story. Because the smoke jumper base is in Southern Oregon. And we've talked about that in previous webinars. So I encourage you to go back and listen to that because here in Oregon, that whole thing of fires, the fire process, and how they affect our Douglas fir trees is kind of that foundational question. And so what affects a tree's growth is what the Apollo moon tree piece and experiment was really all about. So I'm excited because I'm going to quickly just kind of show a little bit of at least of the moon tree that I have here in Oregon. And this is, I think, one of those wonderful things that Globe partners might be able to bring is that it's not necessarily about, it's about the individual. In this case, it's this individual tree, but it's more about how that individual tree fits into the regional and global context, that community, right? So what can this individual tree tell us about what's been happening in our area since 1972 or that era when these tree seedlings or when the tree seeds were collected? I was disappointed to find out that actually the tree seeds that went up in Apollo 14 got mixed all together because the Douglas fir tree seedlings or seeds that were collected for this were collected in Benton County, exactly where Oregon State is located. But they didn't do a good job of record keeping at that time. Maybe they didn't really think that we would come back and do this challenge or quest. But for whatever reason, we do not know where the origin of these trees were or who the parents are of these trees. And so that becomes a little bit of a challenge when we think about growth rates and how might those genetics have played a role in these growth rates. Okay, big ideas there, but it goes back that we have a responsibility of really documenting what we do well because of the reliance that we all have when we look back at time. Here is a picture of the base of the Oregon State University moon tree, which is a Douglas fir tree, which is a evergreen needle leaf tree. And you can actually see that there's a down tree right next to it. So there has been something that has been taking place around this. And that was alluded to with actually finding those locations that had a moon tree or in the larger context that had a tree over the last 50 years is a really important thing that we're documenting. That goes into the carbon cycle and what might be changing. And whether there is actually trees and things on the ground around those moon trees is an important thing. And our photos are a really good rapid assessment. So I just want to kind of highlight, this is what my moon tree looks like. And importantly, you actually see a shrub in front of the actual tree itself. So, and it's behind a chain link fence. So this is one that I can't actually walk to the base of, which is another thing to keep in mind that sometimes, especially with special trees like this, we don't want to go and trample around the roots. So a Globe Observer land cover photo is the best thing that we can do in that case. Because my measurement is going to be off or my estimate is going to be off because I can't walk to the base of the tree. Okay, so considerations with all of these things. But if we go down, I want to sort of highlight that, this tree we know was planted in 1975 because of the media that went around it. And in fact, we can see this is a seedling. In science, this is technically not a tree classification at this point. It's not tall enough, even though the species is in what's growing there is technically a tree. So just kind of pay attention to that because this is where our maps might give us a different impression than what's on the ground. And so if you are out there doing any restoration or if you're doing tree planting, having a photo like this, even though there are people in it, is really useful so that we can have that comparison to, here it is, 35 years later, and how much taller that tree is. And so, you know, to me, that is one of those pieces that is just really important about that. And also, don't click on anything because sometimes it goes away. But what I get really excited about is it's not just that ground perspective where people have been taking photos of those over time, but it's this NASA science. And Brian alluded to this. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to find some complementary data to what NASA has been collecting. So ISAT-2 and JEDI and many of the other NASA missions are up there for a particular period of time. And so, you know, these moon trees were planted, in this case, in 1975. And so there is not a lot of satellite data that was around at that time. And so this is where those ground photos help us to fill in the gap. But over the whole 35 years, and even beyond that, 45 years at this point, since that tree was planted, there have been other remote sensing projects. And here, this is our Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, DOGAMI, but they are another state agency that is collecting remote sensing data. And here, I can actually go to their website for my state, my location, and here is 1 meter laser data that actually shows that moon tree right there. So I can actually use that to get an estimate for height at that moment in time. I think that's really exciting because Brian and the ISAT-2 and the JEDI data isn't 1 meter data. So sometimes NASA has the information, but sometimes you might find it locally. And that's the case here. And I'm really excited about this because one of the things that comes along with this is this building that you see adjacent to kind of the middle of the screen here, this square thing with actual trees growing in the courtyard. That's kind of an interesting thing too. Is that building is no longer there. That was part of that construction that was recorded in some of the Globe Observer photos I've taken recently of this. And that's one reason why that tree was actually behind a gate. And so when we scroll down a little bit, you'll see that this building is not square shaped anymore. It's actually changed as well. So one of the things that sometimes we're targeting a particular tree or we're trying to make a measurement of that. But remember that tree growth is related to what is around it. And so getting that context of land cover is a really important thing because it may help us to describe, wow, this moon tree that had been blocked by this 3-story tall building now is getting more sunlight than it was maybe when it was first planted. That could change its growth rate. They might have added some irrigation when they changed this building. Some of those landscaping pieces are really important to understanding maybe the growth rate of a cultivated tree, like a moon tree that is cared for, tended by people, maybe gets some fertilizer, gets all the water it needs to thrive. That might be a very different growth situation than when we go down and start looking at the other trees that are on campus or near that. I want to point out that I was excited to go to the GlobeViz site, and turning on the thematic map, it actually has the symbol for the Apollo 14 moon tree at this location. And then we have a nice photo of that in the Globe database. So, you know, I was really excited to see that piece, that information on this map. And so even though you may not have a moon tree specifically, you might go and explore to see what are there any important trees in your community that have been highlighted here? And go out and do the same thing. Take photos of them, make those observations, because if it's on a base map like OpenStreetMap, like we use here in the Globe program, that means that there might be some other information about when it was planted and similar sort of data archaeology as what we're doing with the Apollo 14 trees. And importantly, what we'll be doing with all of those schools and organizations that are able to plant this Artemis tree seedling and see, is there going to be a difference? And I'm really interested to see, can we get a tree, a Douglas fir seedling near in similar growing situations as this original Apollo 14? I don't know. That's what I'm going to explore as a Globe partner. Just to give you a little sense, for me, I was finally able to get close to that tree. The gate came down 2 years later. And when I do my tree height estimate, one of the things that we've highlighted in the past and going back to March, if you combine together and at the base of that tree, when you do the circumference, hug the tree, figure out how tall it is or how wide it is, if you incorporate that up photo and do the land cover protocol in Globe Observer, one thing that you're helping us do is record the canopy of that tree. And this is really important because you can tell some things about the growth rate. You might even see limbs that have been cut off because it's been manicured. You might see how much leaf area it actually is obscuring the sky. And that might explain when we go to the satellite view what we're seeing from above. Okay, so that ground photo of the tree canopy is a great way to start understanding that growth rate, and that goes right along with the height, because many trees may not grow upwards, but they might grow outwards at a certain age or at a certain height. Okay, so I love putting this together because this is actually what our moon tree looks like. This is a Douglas fir canopy from below and what it looks like. And if we scroll down, I was finally able to put into the story map here. This is that satellite view of that location. I want to highlight right in the middle here, we see the moon tree. Now, this is where the satellite view can become really challenging to see that individual crown of that tree. Because you can see here, we've got a lot of just green that's coming together. So this is where my ground photo helps us to see what is on the ground underneath all of this green. And then that is a really important thing to help us to understand what other trees might be around this. And one thing that also comes out of this is we see the sun angle because we can see the shadow of our trees. That's an important thing that scientists, land managers, and people who care about who is there, like the Douglas fir tree, that shape of that shadow tells us something and even a little bit more than just that green itself. And so you can actually start using that sun angle with the tree shadow on the ground to understand the species that are there and the difference between some of the deciduous broadleaf trees or broadleaf deciduous trees that Brian has highlighted with his moon trees, like the sycamore trees, versus some of the other leaf types that are out there, like the Douglas fir, which is a needle leaf, and it is evergreen. It's always there. But we do have needle leaf deciduous trees, and we've talked about that in the past. So I just kind of wanted to bring in this satellite perspective of my particular moon tree that here at Oregon State University as a Globe partner, I'm really excited to see and show off, especially as students are coming to our university this summer, our moon tree, and to help them connect to this long-term generational science that the moon trees really represent. And when we plant a tree, it's rarely for us in our generation. It takes that long time for it to grow up and to reach the maturity and the height that it is capable of. I'm going to end my little piece here talking about the Douglas fir moon trees, because the Douglas fir trees 150 years ago were as tall as the coastal redwoods that everybody really loves and hear about. The Douglas fir trees that actually covered the map behind me were 300 to 400 feet tall. And they were just as tall as the giant sequoias and the coastal redwoods of California. And because of the actions that people before me took, those trees are no longer here. The tallest Douglas fir trees that we are now able to find are on the lower end of 300 feet. And so that population of what we see out there, the tree height that we see out there, is a direct result of decisions that were made 150 years ago. And to me, understanding that history of people and what they were doing at that time helps me to understand this particular moon tree and its growth rate. And so I really encourage you to look around and not only think about this particular challenge that NASA has facilitated for us, but also think about what are those special trees in your community that you might want to go out and document and keep track of in the same way that this experiment of moon trees is happening over time. So I encourage you guys to join in the challenge, go out there and set down a marker for the types of trees that are out there. And I think one thing, I guess I was going to continue on here, but I think one thing that is important is to recognize that where trees are located today has a lot to do with us planting them, and who lives there has a lot to do with our decisions as humans. And so as you think about these moon trees, recognize that they grow in a lot of places. And why do they do that? And that goes back to that climate connection. It goes back to the soil connection. And it goes back to what makes a place hospitable to life on Earth for these types of trees. So I'm excited to continue on with this, and definitely let us know if you are in a location that's near a moon tree so that we can also highlight that. And in particular, any of you Globe partners out there, look around and see, are there moon trees around you that we want to highlight, that we can really tell the story of what's happening around you and bring you into this wonderful quest that we're doing. Brian?
All right. Thank you, Peter. Peter Falcon, do you want to, any other questions here that you want to cover before we hop on to the final discussion today?
No, I don't see any. There was a question from Richard, but I think that's more towards John and Elizabeth. So I went and forwarded him their email address so he can ask a question about similar trees for the Artemis quest. But I think we're good.
All right, let me go ahead and reshare this here. All right, so we're going to finish off with a little discussion here. I'm going to start off and then I'll pass it back over to Peter again. So we're going to look at Earth observation timelines, okay? And NASA's created some really cool Earth observing mission timelines here, which I'm going to show you about. I'm going to show a little bit to you. But while you're looking at this and while you're listening to us talk about this and about the Landsat missions as well and what's upcoming for the next webinar, a couple questions here. Why does NASA, and this is just to think about, okay, while you're doing this, and then we can talk at the end. Why does NASA keep launching satellites to look at the same land cover and trees? And also, why do we keep having to measure the same land cover and trees with Globe? Okay, it seems like a couple strange questions, but they're actually super important. And these questions really, help guide, what NASA does and why Globe, maintains these protocols over time and why they're kept, as a primary protocols with the Globe program and as part of several part of the Globe Observer. So let me showcase these a little bit and then I'll pass it over to you, Peter. So we have a couple timelines here that NASA recently updated. And you can see this is a timeline of current and future Earth science missions. And there's a lot going on here, all right? So You can see here, it starts about 1999, even though we know Earth observations have been going on well before that, all right? These are ones that, in 1999, some were launched in 99, and some of these are active today. These are still in space, in orbit, taking observations all the time. But as you can see, as time moves on this timeline, there's more and more satellites sent into space. And so the technology that we have is just getting exponentially better all the time and more advanced, okay? You can see here, like in 99, Terra and Landsat 7, and then all the way, Aqua in 2022, or in 2004, and you go flying all the way up here to like 2018 with ICESat 2 and Grace follow on, and Jedi on ISS, EcoStress, and then, Landsat 8, Landsat 9, SWAT, which Peter mentioned earlier, Surface Water Ocean Topography. And then what we have planned from 2003 all the way through 2033. Now, it's fine to see these missions, but this timeline doesn't really say much about what they do. So NASA also created this other timeline where it has these same missions that you saw here, but it showcases their science focus areas, what the data is used for and what the data is used to study. Okay, and let's just, for instance, let's look at, let's say, you have one with Aqua satellite from 2002. It's looking at all 6 of these variables here. And there are some here that Peter Falcon, Peter Nelson, and I agree that need to have some more of these colors here, because they actually have extended focus areas, not just specific ones. But like Aqua hits on everything: atmospheric composition, carbon cycle and ecosystems, climate variability and change, Earth surface and interior, water and energy cycle, and weather and atmospheric dynamics. And then you hop into something like CloudSat, which Peter is very familiar with, being one of the leads on that mission. CloudSat is looking primarily at atmospheric composition, climate variability and change, and weather and atmospheric dynamics. I'd also throw them as part of the water and energy cycle, okay? Because clouds, as you know, are part of the water cycle. It's a major factor in the water cycle. So, but I think NASA is just focusing on these ones that they're really, really trying to focus on what the science teams for each one of these missions focuses on. So, all those missions that you're seeing here, you can see how they tie into the earth science we do at NASA, and also how they may tie into what we're doing with the GLOBE program, not just the Trees Around the Globe student research campaign, but all the observations. Like, what is it? There are about 50 or so protocols with the GLOBE program. And these missions tie into most of those in some way. So you have this one naming them, and then this one talking about the timeline of, what they're focusing on. And as you can see, the focus just continues to get, bigger and bigger. And then we have these new launch date of things coming up, like Maya and Geocarb and Glimmer and Landsat Next, which Peter will talk about later, which, is looking even, the technology is even more advanced. And we're going to be able to do more comparisons between the satellite data and instrument data with the GLOBE data and the data from other resources out there. A lot of the resources that Peter Nelson has talked about in his presentations, and using online tools, to advance the student research for things like IVSS. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Peter, because I know, Peter, the electromagnetic spectrum is near and dear to your heart. And then we have, as you remember, and I'll jump back a second, we're going to go into Landsat and go through those. So Peter, when you want me just to advance these, let me know, and we'll go from there. So take it away again, Peter.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian. And I appreciate everybody sticking with us. We're, because I think one of the challenges is what the heck is NASA science, and what are we really doing here? We've been asking you to do different things, going out and, we just went over this whole quest thing and going out and making measurements using Globe Observer. So I want to pause for a moment and just recognize that a lot of what we are doing here is trying to gather information to help us understand what these digital sensors are recording. And at a fundamental piece, a lot of that really is the sunlight, how the sunlight is interacting with what is there on the ground, the buildings, the tree canopy, the type of tree canopy that's there, the structure of it, all of those pieces that we recognize on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so the electromagnetic spectrum and understanding that is key, because we use the word bands or spectra or sensors or all of those sort of things a lot. And it all comes back down to this piece: visible light and what we see with our eyes, and that sunlight that gets through the clouds and atmosphere, and all the other energy that could also be used. And this is where NASA is experimenting and finding out what is happening out there. And so, there is this really wonderful tool that I think is a good introduction to what we do, how we do it, and why we're doing it. So spend some time getting to know the electromagnetic spectrum. It really makes a difference, because why does JEDI that sensor record things in the way that it does? There's a reason. Why does ISAT-2 use a different laser color than JEDI? It's all trying to get at the same thing, but there's reasons for why the sensor has the measurements that it does. And it will extend that, and a challenging question is, well, why do we have this blue, green, red on our phones? And that goes right back to the blue, green, red that are the visible light that we are actually picking up. So that piece, I think, is a really important part about what we're doing, how we're doing it. And so, Brian, if you go to the next slide, one of the things that I think is important is to recognize that a lot of what we talk about with trees has to do with multiple measurements. Brian, keeps throwing this question out and challenging us to think about, is that the tallest that tree will get? And the only way to really know that is to have a comparison that allows us to look at the same thing over time. And as I alluded to earlier, and as we've been talking about this whole time, trees are long-lived. And so rarely will the person that planted that tree be the thing, or be the person that actually measures it throughout its entire life. And so same thing with our satellites. Technology has gotten better, as well as, luckily for us, a continuation of these measurements. So again, when we're doing this in the GLOBE community, it's not just for us today to do our own science experiments or to report out to our community, here's the trees, here's where they are, and here's what's happening today. That is a really important piece to report out, but it's only a step on the timeline or the growth of that particular tree, let alone the community around it. So I just want to highlight that, from the beginning with Landsat 1 and the beginning of our remote sensing NASA type of science, we really have been focusing on this tree question. But the technology was good for the time, but you do not see individual treetops. And so we've always had to think about the community that tree is growing in and the characteristics around it. So what was measured in 1970 when those moon trees were put down is different than the measurements and the type of measurements that we can make today with our current JEDI and current Landsat and all of these remote sensing things that we're doing because of NASA's helping to facilitate it, as well as all the other groups. So our step here is to help students actually and ourselves understand not only how the technology has changed, but how we make use of that. And importantly, get ready for this next satellite that will allow us to continue making these measurements and continue tracking how these trees are growing over time. Because in 10 years, there's still gonna be trees, hopefully, that are growing that I'm measuring today, but I'm probably gonna go on and do something else in my life. And so I'm gonna play my part here in helping us to make those measurements today so that people in the future will understand what we're doing. So that's where I am at this moment in time. And so I hope you join me on this piece of what is and where are those trees on Earth right now. Okay, Brian, let's go to the next slide.
All right.
And what I want to highlight is that when we're looking at Earth from space, there's many ways of doing it. And here, I think this is one thing when we look back, we did not record a blue band. The blue light was not recorded with those early instruments. And so you'll see a lot of these reds that actually are telling us the vegetation that's there. Okay, so you have to actually start understanding something about the science measurements, reading a little bit about that to understand what the heck was being measured. And so in this case, all of that red is actually green and vegetation. So I that's one of those things that's literally mind bending when we start looking at this historical information. Okay, but that gives us a baseline of what things were like in 1972 and in those early times. Okay, Brian, if we go to the next slide, we start to see a little bit more information come in with now we actually have that blue light, and we can actually start doing these natural colors. Here we start to see, oh my gosh, it's January. There's not leaves on trees. We have snow to deal with. We now have clouds as well. So if only we had ground photos to help us to understand this, right? But this is the beginning of a lot where we start getting a little bit more detailed. And if we go to the next slide, Brian, here we start iterating through and our technology gets better. We can still see that, in fact, oh man, those clouds are getting in our way again, right, Brian? And we have some that completely block us, and other ones that we can still see through. So this is that piece of at that time, those kids or those communities, this is the view of Earth at that time, and we start getting that photosynthesis and that green that we can actually start to see. So if we go to the next one, Brian. Here, our instruments start getting better. We start getting our multispectral sensors, and you can start to see the differences in that natural color and some of the combinations that start to really enhance the features that we're after. Next one, Brian, if we go to Landsat 5, this is where a lot of our time series will start. And I'm just gonna, hit on this right here. And Brian, what I'd like to do is I'm gonna grab the screen really quick.
Yep.
And show people, since we've been talking about my moon tree, I just want to quickly show everybody here what you can do. Let's see. Hopefully it's not the right one, is that, Brian? Let's see. I'm gonna share my screen one more time.
Yeah, right.
You don't want to see that one. But here, what we've been able to do now is start putting together the time series of my particular moon tree. And so there's tools like this that we've highlighted in the past, and I just clicked on my location where the moon tree is, and you'll see that starting in 1984, I actually have a greenness. And we've highlighted kind of what some of these things mean, but we actually have a measurement from those satellites over 35 years going to most recently last summer of that photosynthesis. And so I can actually use that to understand that particular moon tree, what was happening around it. And so, as we scroll down and look at those satellite observations for that location, we can start to understand the moon tree growth rate. We can start putting together this growth rate or leaf area that we see from space. And it's just incredible how this generational aspect of the globe database together with the satellite database allows us to start looking at places over time. And so next week, next month, when you come back, we want to talk a little bit about what the heck are these numbers that you can see, because you'll go to a lot of satellite locations and they'll give you these names, these acronyms. So we really want to help you to start thinking about photosynthesis. What is it that plants are actually doing that allow us to look at growth rates, these spectral pieces, these measurements, these numbers that are coming from space? Importantly, there are tools that help us to understand what to expect as we use the measurements from space. And this gets back into the species. And so we can actually go in and look at differences between different types of trees. In this case, say, our deciduous trees. They actually are doing different things when we look at our measurements, okay? And what I'm really excited about and what we want to bring to you as a community is this handheld way that you can do exactly what those satellites are doing. You can measure the wavelengths. And so we're going to get in and describe this particular sensor, and I'm going to leave it right there. But how does this complement what we're doing from space? It's actually making these same measurements of sunlight on the ground that we can take back to what we're seeing here in space. So I hope that you join us on this, because we really want to help us move towards and to anticipate not only what data is out there right now, but importantly, in 5 years, we're going to be able to make a lot more measurements in using the same sensor or the same type of sensor, but we're going to be able to get much more at that growth rate. And so we really want to start getting at not only what we're measuring with Globe Observer, but take us to what NASA is measuring in terms of the health rate, the health of these forests, the photosynthesis that correspond to what we see on the ground, and that growth rate, that canopy, and all of those pieces. So I really hope that you guys all spread the word and go out, join the quest, make some observations. But let's start thinking about and tying back to that photosynthesis, measuring the photosynthesis that is happening on the ground as well as from space. So join us to learn a little bit more about Stella and this wonderful engineering tool that you can bring into your classroom to not only go outside and understand the world around you, but to do some really interesting modeling of growth rates and the vegetation around us. All right, Brian, I'm going to throw it back to you.
All right, thank you. All right, we only have a couple more slides here, but as Peter mentioned, thank you for hanging on with us, because I mentioned earlier we had a really jam-packed agenda today. So let me go ahead and pop that here. All right, so here we have that Landsat 5 and Landsat 6, okay? Not much else to say about that, but it never achieved orbit. It was launched on July 23rd, 1972. Peter, Landsat 7.
Yeah. So Landsat 7 was a great one because this is the beginning of sort of modern remote sensing. They gave us a global data set. And so if you're outside of the United States, this 1999 period is kind of the beginning of your consistent time series. And then we had some failures and some issues that we'll talk about when we get into the data from this particular satellite. But it really was the beginning of what we're doing today globally with it. And here, Brian, if you go to the next slide, you know, it took us almost 14 years to launch the next Landsat satellite sensor and sensor for that consistency. But this is a really exciting one because it added on some additional features that allow us to look at cirrus clouds and identify them compared to all the other types of clouds that were out there. That was causing us all kinds of problems. So that aspect of why this sensor came on really goes back to this: what do we see from Earth from space? And if you go to the next one, Landsat 9 really was basically the same sensor as Landsat 8. They had some leftover parts, so they actually put that together, but they improved a couple things. And so Landsat 8 and Landsat 9 data are very complementary because they were planned that way. And so right now, this is a really new data set that a lot of people have not explored. And I encourage all of our Globe community and Globe students to look at this particular data set of Landsat 8, Landsat 9, because they allow you to do time series and look at phenology changes of your trees and to look at what is happening at that location, not just over time, but actually on almost a weekly basis, unless you have popcorn clouds and other things like that that get in your way and force you into using your ground observations. So this series of satellites is really wonderful, and it leads up to our next one, Brian, which is Landsat Next. And I want to end kind of with this notion of NASA is planning for the future. They are planning missions. And so we can actually plan for how our data and what we do today can be used when we get new instruments in space. And so as you're thinking about your own place, your own globe community, and I think it's really wonderful to think about what's coming in the future. And in 5 years, we will have this new data set that allows us to improve our data collection and go from every 16 days down to every 6 days of satellite observation. That allows us to actually see that phenology change on a daily basis. Then we're going to get more information that tell us about the type of species that are out there. What's the difference, and how might the environment be impacting things like photosynthesis? So we'll just end up having so much more data that we can understand our world, but it requires us to really be diligent about our data collection today so that we can understand what those measurements are when they get online. And we can actually prepare our students to do that NASA science and to be involved in something that I know I might or might not be able to actually see on my own computer because of my place on this timeline. So that's where we're going to go with our next webinar. And we want to invite you in and get you thinking about how we could actually measure and quantify not only photosynthesis, but that larger carbon cycle and the water cycle that's there. Brian?
All right, so here's a nice video that was put together, which will kind of sum up a lot what Peter was just talking about. So this is a really cool video. It's only about 2 minutes long, but it really contains some great information. So here we go. All right, there you go. Peter, do you want to talk a little bit about this, like real quickly, about the importance of having these harmonized and combined data sets? I know we don't have much time, but this is just something that we will be playing with more in the future with, a combination of, you can see some of the NASA satellites, with Landsat and Sentinel-2 with the European Space Agency and others.
Yeah, and so what we kind of went over quickly or tried to highlight here is that NASA is helping us to continually understand the limitations of our measurements. Sometimes they're really good, and we can answer a lot of information with the sensors from the 1970s. However, one of the things that's really important is to understand what the sensor is measuring up in space and what is happening on the ground. And how do we actually combine together all of these different satellites and measurements that we've been talking about? And it's not straightforward, it's not easy, but the whole idea and the whole notion is to understand that electromagnetic spectrum. Each one of our sensors is recording things that overlap because it's measuring the same thing, sunlight or reflected sunlight. And so over the last 50 years, we've learned a variety of limitations, and we're trying to overcome them to give us continuous measurements of what's on the ground and in space. So that is what we're going to talk about how do we do this? And the Stella sensors is a handheld, make-it-yourself tool that has been developed by some engineers, and you can see it there, that record and make measurements in similar way as a lot of the sensors up in space. And so this is an important key that scientists have. They have 10 to 12 to $50,000 pieces of equipment themselves that go out and make these measurements of sunlight on the ground. And so what we want to help you to really do is make this connection between the globe observations and the type of measurements that NASA makes with satellites. And that is measurements of that sunlight or the reflected light. And here is a brand new tool that actually allows you to develop that yourself and to make those measurements. And it complements the Globe Observer land cover photos in particular, or even the cloud photos. So, and we'll talk a lot about how we go from a single point measurement, like a Stella measurement here, used with this particular sensor, up to how we make those digital images that we were seeing earlier. It's the same concept, it's the same thing, but now you have a way of actually making these. And I do think it's important to highlight here that, because it's a sensor and it uses technology like that, there could be limitations in particular countries to getting all the pieces to make this happen, because of export controls and some other issues like that. But that's where, work with us, let the Globe implementation office and your Globe country coordinators know that you're interested in bringing this engineering design to your students. And we will try to help everybody be able to not only make these sort of instruments and make these measurements, but to help us to understand some of the limitations that might be out there as we try to collect similar information that bridges the world between the physical world of globe measurements to the digital world and universe of NASA measurements. So come back in July.
Yep. So yeah, with all that said, the final slide here and final discussion for today is we invite you, as Peter just did, to our next campaign webinar, which is on Tuesday, the 11th of July, 2023, at the same time as today, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. UTC, 7 p.m. Central European Summer Time. This is going to be the State of Trees, July 2023, looking at land cover through the historic eyes of Landsat satellites, remote sensing, and the interactive do-it-yourself handheld spectrometer tool, Stella. So stay tuned for that. You will get an invite very soon from me to put this on your calendar and learn more about this. Peter will be talking, as well as our colleague, Michael Taylor. He is with the Landsat team, and he is an expert on Stella, and he demos it all around the world, in person and virtually. So he was just doing it at AwesomeCon, basically a comic convention in Washington, D.C. that I was part of this weekend with ISET 2. So stay tuned for that and join us next month on the 11th of July, 1 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. UTC, 7 p.m. CEST. So thank you, everyone. Are there any more questions in the chat last minute, Peter? If not, we will say goodbye for now.
No, I don't see anything, just comments. A lot of thank yous as well. I don't see anything yet. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.